Okay, folks, if you don't mind, we'll get the show on the road. First of all, a little bit of introduction. James Williams, or Jim Williams, is on Skype. Jim is basically the person in charge of the FAA department that we as modelers are dealing with. Jim, can you hear us on?
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Jim. I'm Bob Brown, president of the Academy. With us, we have James Sizemore from the FAA. Next to me, I have Rich Hansen from the AMA. Jim, we welcome you. We thank you for your efforts. For those of you in the audience that don't know, Jim was supposed to be here live and in color. However, unfortunately, he met up with a fall down the stairs. He hurt his back, and hopefully your back is a little bit better today. But I know that the trip out here would have been pretty doggone hard. We thank you for your efforts at hooking up with Skype and addressing this group.
Thanks. Yeah, my back's getting better, and hopefully I'll be completely well in a few weeks, and I'll be able to attend a future event. I'm really sorry I'm not going to be there in person. I was really looking forward to this event, seeing all of the model aircraft, and I will definitely get to a future event.
Okay, we again thank you, and James, we thank you for being here in person. The game plan for this activity today is basically we are going to address questions to Jim and James, basically to formulate some opinions or direction from the FAA. The Academy has put forth some new proposals. Those proposals went forth right at the beginning of the year, and I know because of the holidays and so forth, the gentlemen from the FAA have not had adequate time to really evaluate, but I'm sure that they're aware of it. We're going to ask Jim the questions. In some ways, I'm sure that he has the answers. In other ways, I'm sure that he's going to defer to James, since James has worked with us now for approximately 3.5 years or so. So to say that Jim is not the expert, that's not true. He is the expert, but he's the new guy on the block. So if he defers to to James, please bear with us and whatever.
There's only about 5 or 6 Jameses and Jims in the office, so it's
Yeah.
Well, pardon my ignorance for calling one Jim and one James and not knowing which was which, so bear with me. Anyways, Rich, could you give us let's say a general overview of where we're going, what we've been doing, and let Jim and James listen in, and then I have some specific questions we have generated. Then I'll pass out some cards, and I'll take some answers or questions from the floor, and we'll go from there. I have set a 1-hour time limit on this event, so enjoy. Rich?
Thank you, Bob. For those of you that were at the general membership meeting this morning, you got a little bit of a taste of this. And as you know, we've been involved in the effort to create new regulations for unmanned aircraft so that they can fly in the national airspace since about 2008. We participated in the original Aviation Rulemaking Committee, as did a lot of the other stakeholders in the industry, to make recommendation to FAA for new regulation to enable this industry in the civil airspace. And I'm not going to go all the way back to the history of drones, as they're called in the media, or unmanned aircraft, RPVs, UAVs, whatever title you want to give them. But I will say that what has happened in the last decade to a decade and a half is we're starting to see the technology mature to the point that it actually has become viable for commercial and public use operations in the civil airspace. And although model aircraft have been in that space for well over 100 years, I mean, we have a very unique and distinct niche in the recreational arena. And to our credit, maybe to our discredit, and we've operated harmoniously within our communities to the point that we're almost transparent to the issues that are now on the table in terms of UAS. But moving forward from 2008 to how we got here today, right after the Aviation Rulemaking Committee made its recommendations to the FAA, we were going down what I called a dual path. They had two approaches to model aviation, or to recreational UAS. One approach was for those people that weren't really interested in doing this in an organized fashion. They basically choose to go out and purchase their own equipment, find a safe place to fly, and operate independent of any organizations. And then we have the other community, and what I believe to be a much larger community of people that are within the AMA that have worked within a community-based program for since 1936, for over 76 years since AMA was founded, and operate under a set of community safety guidelines, what we call our National Model Aircraft Safety Code, and that have actually created this excellent safety record that has achieved over the last 76 years. So this two-path approach would have a set of regulations that would have some pretty finite criteria as how you might go out and participate in model aviation on your own. And then we were going to do some standards, which is an actually official term within the regulatory environment that talks about a set of guidelines that can be used in parallel with, or in some cases in lieu of, regulation to achieve the same safety results. And by creating this set of standards, the community-based community, or the model aircraft community within our community, would be given a little bit more latitude based upon the criteria that was established in the standards. As we got into this road, and we worked on the standards for, 3-4 years, since 2009, yes, until just until 2012, so that's 3 years. We've been working on the standards, and we did some great work. And FAA's been at the table the entire time. We've had a standards development committee that has worked very, very hard, working almost on a weekly basis on conference and webinar calls to develop these standards. And we got some very, very good work done. We really ironed out some issues. But to a certain extent, we're starting getting down into some real detail criteria that probably, at least in our opinion, doesn't fit real well with the recreational community that is in our membership. So we were looking for a kinder and gentler way of handling this, and I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but that, quite honestly, was the way it was presented to us when we first met with the Unmanned Program Office in 2008, is they were really looking to look outside the box and find a way that they could point to a community-based organization's safety program and say that as long as model aviation is conducted in accordance with that program, then there wouldn't be a need to be addressed through regulation. The problem being that under Title 49, the authority of the FAA is pretty well spelled out, and the mechanism for doing that was not really easily found. So we did get some help from the U.S. Congress this last year. We were able to work with some of the key aviation and transportation committees, and we got an amendment to the FAA reauthorization bill that had been in Congress for 4 or 5 years, trying to pass through new enabling and spending authorization for the FAA for its next-gen program and for the next 20 to 30 years. So in that, there was an amendment that talked about model aviation that's conducted by a community-based organization that would be, in essence, exempt from regulation, provided that, one, you met some very basic safety criteria that talked about non-interference with manned aviation, certain criteria that you do when you're in close proximity to the airports, and the basic requirement of operating within visual line of sight and avoiding other traffic. And then through the enactment of that bill, then we would actually move forward with identifying AMA as a community-based organization, recognizing AMA safety program as a safety program as delineated in the legislation, and 3, developing a relationship between the AMA and the FAA to make sure that our safety program remained viable year after year and was updated as necessary as new technology emerges, as new issues came to the forefront, and just to resolve even administrative issues that might occur as you're trying to move forward in the aviation environment. The unmanned aircraft industry itself is going to create some very interesting and maybe even challenging situations in terms of how that's going to get integrated into the airspace. And I'll leave that for Jim and James to talk about. But and specifically in terms of model aviation, we're looking at moving that forward through a community-based organization as described in the law and a memorandum of understanding between the AMA and the FAA. Now that bill was passed back in February, and we weren't the only ones written into that law. There were some other provisions in there that talks about the unmanned aircraft industry in terms of commercial and public use operations as well. So it actually put a big load on the FAA plate, and they have been working through Jim as the executive manager over what is now called the Unmanned Aircraft Systems Integration Office to work through these issues and figure out how they're going to meet the provisions that Congress has put into the law and still make sure that UAS are integrated into the national airspace in a safe and responsible and cooperative manner. So it took a few months to get around to talking with us on exactly how our provision within the bill would be enacted. But we did start having some meaningful dialogue back in September that talked about looking at an MOU as a way of enacting the bill, about recognizing AMA as a community-based organization, and working cooperatively to make sure that the safety guidelines and criteria are adequate to make sure that model aviation continues to operate safely in the future. So that's pretty much where we are today. AMA put together a proposal. We worked on it for about 8-10 weeks. A proposal to the FAA to be recognized as a community-based organization. They have a copy of our entire safety program. We've even drafted an MOU as a starting point to start talking about how an MOU may be structured and how it might work to help us enact this law. And we just delivered that to James's office and Mr. Williams' staff within the last 8 to 10 days. So I know they haven't had a chance to fully digest that, but I think we're on the page in terms of how we're going to move forward. And with 2013, I think we're going to see some meaningful work towards establishing that relationship. And that brings us up to date, Bob.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Jim Williams, do you have anything you'd like to add to Rich's dialogue?
Yeah, I thought I would go into a little more detail, if you don't mind, on the law and what it means to us. For those of you out there, you may or may not know that there are two different kinds of bills that the Congress uses to direct the federal government and how it works. One, they're supposed to do every year. They haven't had a very good track record of accomplishing that, but every year they're supposed to give us an appropriation, tell us how much money to use and what to spend it on. But every agency in the federal government has to have an authorization bill. And essentially, what an authorization bill does is it creates or modifies the instructions on a federal agency. So essentially, if your authorization lapses, you sort of cease to exist in legal parlance. So the FAA's bill was re-upped last year. So about in February of last year, they gave us new instructions on what they wanted us to be, what they wanted the FAA to be. There were a whole bunch of provisions in that law, on pretty much everything to do with aviation, but there was a whole subsection on unmanned aircraft. And that essentially gave me and my office our marching orders for the next 3 or 4 years about all the things they want us to do. So, I think you understand that the unmanned aircraft provisions are really important because there's a whole section 336 of that bill that deals with model aviation. So I think that really puts you guys on the map as you're actually in the FAA's authorization and recognized as such. And it's got 3 sections in that, or 3 divisions within that. And the first section really talks about the rulemaking, relates and basically says FAA, you don't need to make any rules for model aircraft if they're operated according to community-based safety guidelines. And I think, modeled on, I believe this is indeed modeled on exactly what AMA is and what they do. Although the bill doesn't specifically call out AMA, but it does call out that you have to, be operating under for a hobby or recreational use only. Talk more about commercial use later. Operating community-based safety guidelines like AMA has. But Congress established a 55-pound limit for model aircraft for the most part. They said if it's heavier than 55 pounds, then you have to follow design, construction, inspection, test, and safety, the safety program of the community-based organization. So in other words, they're allowing us to apply a little bit stricter guidelines from the safety-based organization, not from the FAA, on larger model aircraft. Then it goes on to say, hey, you got to stay away from from manned aircraft and give way to manned aircraft. And then there's some special criteria in there around being near airports, which is real important to the FAA. If you're within 5 miles of an airport, you must coordinate with the air traffic control tower, if there is one at that airport. And if you set up a permanent facility where you're going to operate model aircraft often, frequently, then you're encouraged to go and set up an actual, written agreement on how you're going to conduct operations and how you're going to coordinate. So the next section of the bill talks about the fact that although it tells us not to regulate model aircraft, it also goes on to say that the FAA isn't limited from enforcing its existing rules for safety. So if a model aircraft endangers the safety of the nest, then the FAA is supposed to do something about that. And the rule that we usually talk about when we talk about endangering the national airspace system is Rule 9113, which is titled Careless or Reckless Operation. And what it says is that no person may operate an aircraft in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger the life or property of another. In other words, you can't, the law doesn't exempt model aircraft from the basic governing premise of the FAA, and that's, we want to have a safe national airspace system. It also applies to operations at airports, and we have in the past, in very extreme cases, actually issued fines for folks who were, I think the only ones we find are actually commercial operators who were pretending to be modelers, but nonetheless, we applied that careless and reckless behavior criteria to them. So another aspect of that, the safety of the NAS, and this is probably not of interest to anybody in the audience there from the Washington D.C. area, Virginia, Maryland. Don't see any hands up, but there is a special rule in our area here in D.C. For national security purposes that they have forbidden all model aircraft or model rocket operations within a 30-mile radius of Washington National Airport. And I bring this up because it did actually happen. There were some modelers, near the edge of that area, but within it, who were picked up on radar, and they got a visit from the FBI, essentially asking them to stop their operations. So, those are sort of the exceptions to the FAA is not going to regulate model aircraft. And then in the very last bit of the bill of the section on model aircraft is just a legal definition of what it means to be a model aircraft. And basically it says it's an aircraft. That means it's capable of sustained flight in the air. And it has to be flown within visual sight of the pilot. So that means the pilot has to be able to keep it in sight at all times. And the rationale behind that is if you can see your aircraft, then you can see other manned aircraft that might be near it and deconflict the two. And then finally, it says hobby or recreational purposes. And that's really important because there's a lot of people out there who are abusing the modeler's privileges by conducting commercial operations or for hire operations using unmanned aircraft. And the bottom line there is it's really easy to tell the difference. If you're getting paid to do it, you're not a modeler. Very simple. It's all about the kind of operation you're conducting. You're doing it for fun. You're doing it for your own pleasure, your own interest. There, you're a modeler. If somebody's paying you to operate that aircraft, then it becomes a commercial operation. And the rule excuse me, we're working on a small rule that was done through an aviation rulemaking committee, and that's where we bring in the community of interest to advise us on what should be in the rule. And that rule is, nearing the stage when it can get published for comment. And then in a couple of years after that, it becomes an actual rule. And that addresses how you go about legally conducting small unmanned aircraft operations for hire, for compensation. So until that rule comes out, anyone wanting to conduct operations for hire has to follow the existing FAA rules about obtaining certification, obtaining pilot license, and obtaining an operating permit to conduct commercial operations, which we all agree is way onerous for the small UAS community, and that's why we're writing the small UAS rule to essentially deregulate that portion of the community down to a much lower level of oversight. I can't really talk to you in the details about what's in the rule because while it's in this internal review process, we're supposed to keep it just within the government. And once it goes out for public comment, then of course we can talk about it in detail. And so once that happens, then maybe the thing for me to do is to come back and I can answer specific questions about what's in the rule. But one thing we are going to do in that rule is to incorporate this language, this Section 336 language of the law will go into that rule. So it'll be clear to anybody, both inside the government and outside, that these criteria, if they're met, mean that the small unmanned aircraft rule doesn't apply. So in closing, I just want to thank AMA again for inviting me to come, and I'm really, really sorry that I'm not there because I was looking forward to seeing all the exhibits in the exhibit hall. And I was hoping maybe I'd buy a model of myself and try to become a modeler while I was there, but that's still to be done. I mean, I was an avid model rocket guy when I was a teenager, so it would be a lot of fun to get back into model aviation. But as we've spoken, the FAA and AMA have been working together for over 5 years, and we're busy taking a look at their proposal. And I personally am dedicated to moving ahead quickly to recognize AMA under the law as a community-based organization with a safety program that will enable the community to the members of AMA and the folks who operate according to the AMA rules to be operating under the protection of this new law. And I think the FAA and AMA's relationship has never been stronger, and that we're going to be working together over going forward, really, with no end in sight, to make sure that model aircraft operations remain safe and fun for everybody. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you guys for any questions.
Okay, Jim, I thank you. And in looking at the questions that we prepared, I'm sure there's going to be some duplication between what you have said and what Rich has said, but I think it can help clarify those thoughts that we have here in the audience. Question number 1 basically asks, given the congressional provisions in the FAA Modernization and Reform Act regarding UAS, can you describe the UAS Integration Office's plan for moving forward with UAS integration and meeting the deadlines established by law?
So if I were to get into all the detail of everything we have going on, I would be talking until our hour was up, which I'm sure is not what you intended. We were pretty busy inside the office doing a lot of stuff before we got this 7 pages of legislative mandates. I think the best way to answer that question will be to take a look at our roadmap, which we're going to publish no later than February 14th. We're actually getting very close to publication of that roadmap, and it'll be on the FAA's website, and it'll essentially spell out all of the activities we're going to be conducting over the next 5 years in a good bit of detail.
Okay, thank you. Question number 2. Section 336 of the Act establishes a special rule for model aviation operated in accordance with the safety programming of a community-based organization. Can you give us insight into the UAS Integration Office's approach to enacting this provision?
Well, I think we've worked hard to try to figure out exactly how we're going to enact that, and I think the solution we've all agreed upon is that we will establish criteria by which we'll recognize community-based organizations. And right now, we're in the process of working that with AMA, and we don't have anybody else asking for recognition at this point, so we're pretty confident that AMA will be the first and perhaps the only organization recognized under that the law, and then eventually it'll be according to the rules, but the process won't be any different. So that's our plan going forward, and I think we're very positive results to date on how we're going to get there in a timely manner.
Thank you. In the past several years, the FAA's focus in regards to UAS integration has been on the safety of the national airspace and operational coordination. Given recent concerns regarding privacy and the Fourth Amendment protections, can you tell us how this might, if at all, change FAA's focus in moving forward in its plan to integrate UAS and NAS?
So the FAA's mandate, and if you read the entire 1,000 pages or whatever it is of our reauthorization bill, I don't think you'll find the word privacy mentioned in there once. The FAA has no legal authority given to us by Congress to do anything relative to the privacy. Our mandate is all about the safety and efficient operation of the national airspace system, and we plan to remain laser focused on that goal. Unfortunately for the unmanned aircraft community, the privacy aspects have become a very big deal in the press. So although we don't plan to create any sort of mechanism for the FAA to do anything about privacy, we are being forced to at least acknowledge and understand the implications of integrating UAS into the NAS, the privacy implications of integrating UAS in the NAS. Interestingly enough, the Fourth Amendment protects individuals from, the government, basically, from exceeding their authority and prying into people's personal lives without due cause. And the law enforcement agencies are very well aware of that, and the law enforcement agencies that are using unmanned aircraft are very strict about how they use them so that they don't violate the Fourth Amendment. Because if they do, then any evidence they gather with that unmanned aircraft would be thrown out in court. So, they're very careful and very, none of the law enforcement agencies that we work with who use unmanned aircraft use them for surveillance, like the military does. They're small unmanned aircraft that aren't that much different than the model aircraft that folks in the audience operate. And so they're used for finding lost people. One of the biggest uses that law enforcement is doing now is accident or crime scene reconstruction, and they can fly an unmanned aircraft over a crime scene and very quickly collect information that would take them hours and hours to do manually, and it's much more accurate and much more easy to use as evidence going forward. So that I think it's unfortunate that the public opinion has reached the point it has, because there really isn't any actual abuses that have ever taken place. The one thing that got everybody so spun up last summer was a story that was actually false, that the Environmental Protection Agency was using unmanned aircraft to enforce the Clean Water Act. And it just exploded on the internet and Twitter, and it was amazing how the backlash against what was actually a false story. The EPA has never used unmanned aircraft, nor have they ever asked us if they could use unmanned aircraft to enforce the Clean Water Act. They do use manned aircraft, have for years, and but so we're dealing with it. We're aware of it, but again, it's really not the FAA's responsibility to enforce privacy.
Thank you. AMA believes strongly that model aviation and model operations are distinctly different as far as the platforms and operations envisioned for commercial and public use on UAS. Can you give us your views on this important issue?
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think the operations for compensation and hire are very different. They're typically going to be conducted in around something that needs to be looked at with cameras, with fairly close proximity operations, whereas the model aircraft, you're flown in areas away from people and away from structures. So I mean, it's really apples and oranges in my mind, and I think it's very appropriate that we have this strong distinction drawn in law between the two types of operation. And it's just unfortunate that there's a lot of people out there who are trying to hide behind model aircraft, model aviation to do what amounts to illegal commercial activities.
Okay, model aircraft have operated in the national airspace for more than 100 years and have established an excellent safety record under the guidance of the AMA National Model Airplane Safety Code. Can you tell us where you may see any voids or gaps in AMA's safety program, and do you see any specific model airplane operations that need further attention in regards to safety?
Well, in this case, this question is one that I have little or no expertise on, because I'm neither a model aviator or experienced with your safety standards. On the other hand, sitting next to you is a guy who's been in model aviation for a long time and is currently a member of AMA, and who has been working on the FAA side of the model aviation for years. So I'm going to let James take this question.
Thanks, Jim. So I think the best way to put this is came out in the presentation this morning that you provided, looking at the technologies that are coming into play with model aviation, and a lot of the 2.5 years, 3 years worth of work that we did do to establish standards with AMA, which, as Rich had stated earlier, was a great deal of consideration in all aspects of model aviation. That the introduction of those new technologies really needs to be done in a way that considers how they might impact it. So, for instance, the easiest one to bring up as an example is first-person view, and there are a lot of ways, and I know that AMA has in their safety code, the updated safety code, first-person view safety standards. And in that, I think that's an example of how new technology, people are going to want to use it more and more. The topic of altitude equipment within your aircraft and boundary protection. Your reliance on technology is going to increase, and I think as it increases, one of the aspects that Rich had brought up earlier about an ongoing relationship with the FAA to make sure that those the safety code is relevant. That's where we need to make sure that we focus our efforts. That the change, that it enables model aircraft operators, owners to enjoy the hobby, introduce new technologies, and at the same time do that safely based on some guidance that hopefully AMA and others may come up with in the future.
Okay, thank you, James. In the next few minutes, we're going to pass out some cards, and I want you, if you have questions, to please put those questions down on the cards. Dave Mathewson and a couple others are going to be passing them out and collecting them. In order to continue with this, let's say I have a couple more questions that we've generated, and while we're, coming up with the dialogue, please fill out the questions and pass them in. The next question basically says, in reference to the question above, have there been any recent model aviation or recreational UAS incidents that have caused concern?
Well, I've been involved in or aware of 4 different incidents where we've investigated and taken some sort of action as the FAA from people who were purporting, and I say that they were purporting to be model aviators, but I think that in all cases they were really operating outside of the safety guidelines that AMA has established. So even by the law, they really kind of stepped outside of that. In some cases, they were commercial operations. In one case, we actually had a would-be terrorist trying to use a model aircraft to actually crash into buildings with explosives. That individual is now in jail, and his rather large model aircraft was confiscated. There was another incident in Florida where a couple of guys were in a public park with lots of people around, and decided their quadcopter would make a great device to follow people around. And a woman started running away from it because it frightened her, and they tried to chase her, and they ran into her, and the quadcopter cut her up. Again, obviously not operating according to the safety guidelines that AMA would have. There was another individual who flew his quadcopter very close to the approach path to Boston Logan Airport and posted his adventure on YouTube. So we had to speak with that individual and ask him not to do that anymore. So yeah, there are some incidents, but I think the ones that have given us concern are the people that aren't following the safety guidelines. So I think that the system that we've created really does create a safe operating climate in the NAS for model aircraft operated safely.
Okay, thank you. Last question that we have basically says many members of the aeromodeling community are interested in using their skill and experience as modelers in becoming involved in commercial UAS and perhaps establishing a commercial UAS operation. Do you have any advice for these individuals in regards to compliance with existing FAA rules and policies, and how might they prepare for entering this industry once UAS operations are enabled?
Well, my first advice is that the learning how to be a safe operator is rule number one. Secondly, once the small unmanned aircraft rule comes out for comment, which it will in a few months, take a look at that and let us know if you think that we've gone too far or if we've forgotten something or whatever, and that'll help us write a better rule. But the bottom line is that until we get that rule out, it's going to be very difficult to conduct commercial operations in the United States legally. If you're selling your services to take photographs of real estate, that's not allowed under the current set of regulations that we have. It's unfortunate because I think that done safely, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. But until we can catch the rules up to the technology, it remains against the rules and against the law.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the audience? Thank you, Dave. Okay, what special issues should we consider when an AMA club operates on an uncontrolled airport?
I think I'm going to let James answer that one. He's probably much smarter about that than I am.
I'll just start off with wow. That's a very complex question. We've worked closely with the airports organization within the FAA, and we actually went in one case, and Rich is actually probably more versed on that than we are, since he works directly with clubs that are trying to maintain their ability to fly at airfields where they've had permission. But one of the biggest challenges with flying at a public airport, towered or otherwise, is that federal funds are expended to upgrade and provide for that airport's existence. And in doing that, there's a clause in it that says that everybody that wants to or would like to have access to that to use it must have free and unfettered access to it. So equal and free access to it. So if operations are taking place at those airports, then there may be a conflict with the manned aircraft community using that airport. So that's the biggest one that pops up in my mind. I know that there's a lot of debate, and that organization, the airports organization, is very, very engaged with considering how model aircraft should or should not be operated at airports. And Rich, you've got the background on several cases that you've worked.
Yeah, it's a real complex issue, and it's really not. It's unresolved at this point, and probably we could talk. Anybody wants to talk to me personally about it afterwards? It would be a pretty good dialogue, and would take some time. But the bottom line is that there is some inconsistency, if you can imagine that, some inconsistency within the FAA in terms of its approaches to, in this case specifically, model aviation, whereas we're viewed as an aircraft by definition, and as such an aeronautical activity because we operate in the airspace. In the airport side of it, in terms of the compliance for federally obligated airports, we've actually been identified as a non-aeronautical activity, and that's why it becomes a concern when model aircraft are on the airport that they're saying because they're not an aeronautical activity, don't have this right to equal and unfettered access that James is talking about. We obviously would disagree with this. You can't have it both ways. But I don't think this issue is going to get totally resolved until we get further down the road on how all unmanned aircraft are going to be treated in the airspace. So, and right now within the FAA, when we've talked to the people at the national level in terms of airport compliance, I've been told that they're leaving it to the regional district offices to interpret the advisory circular and to enact it at the local level based upon their situational awareness of that particular location. So it's not a good answer, but that's the answer for now, and it's something that we continue to work with, and we're hoping that once we've established this permanent or this definitive relationship with the UAS Integration Office, who will hopefully then be a portal for other aspects of the FAA where we have issues that need to be resolved, that we'll be able to bring this one to the table too. The other issue is the TFR issue too, which I'm not going to go into that today, but that's another unresolved issue that's on the table as well.
James, you have anything additional? Okay.
Complex.
Next question. Can a decision on rulemaking for model airplane operations be finalized independent of commercial and public service UAS rules?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's what the law essentially says, is that model aircraft are distinct and separate and need to be treated separately from commercial aircraft operations. So, I think the Congress has answered that very clearly, and their direction will be reflected in the small rule, so that anybody who picks up that rule will know that you're either a modeler and the criteria in the law apply, or you're not, and then the criteria in the rule apply.
Thank you. It's been noted that there is a large amount of UAV flyers in the hobby area who for years have been flying safely using technology that can exceed visual line of sight.
Mm-hmm.
And while there is a total need to protect full-scale on property, there seems to be many plans to conduct further than visual line of sight without issues, but no seemingly openness to this. Will the FAA be open to accepting options like this in the future?
So the current rules, there's a rule in the 91 operating rules that's essentially establishes the requirement for all aircraft to be able to see and avoid other aircraft. There's another rule that says you have to remain well clear of other aircraft so as not to cause a risk of collision. given that the pilot's on the ground, we consider that rule to be complied with by virtue of you being able to see your aircraft in the sky and the manned aircraft in the sky, and then you can steer your aircraft away from the other. As soon as you go beyond your ability to see your position relative to a manned aircraft, now those manned aircraft are at risk for a collision. Um, and nobody, a lot of people have argued, well, you know, hobby aircraft are small and they're not gonna damage a uh, manned aircraft. And as many of you know, you operate some pretty large aircraft that could conceivably do a lot of damage to a manned aircraft, especially rotorcraft, who are very fragile. I don't know why anybody flies in those things unless they're going to the hospital, but nonetheless, there's a lot of them out there, and they operate at very low altitudes, and legally that's fully legal for a rotorcraft to operate at very low altitude. So if you fly beyond your ability to see your aircraft, then you won't be able to see the other aircraft and avoid them. And that is another existing Part 91 rule, which Congress has said that we still need to enforce to maintain the safety of the national airspace system. So unfortunately, until we can the technology and the rules can catch up to each other. I mean, it's theoretically possible with military technology that you could have a helmet on that would allow you to turn your head and see all around your aircraft better than you could from the ground. But to date, that technology hasn't made it from the military into the civilian market, and we don't have a way of proving it, even if it had. So, I mean, I think eventually we'll probably get there. But for the time being, you've got to rely on your eyeballs to make sure that there's nobody to run into out there.
Could I follow up on that question? You actually can avoid a full-scale aircraft very easily. When you're in an aircraft flying, the engine sound prohibits you from hearing other aircraft. So you're relying on your sight. But from a model aviator's point of view, when you're standing on the ground flying it beyond line of sight, I can hear any full-scale aircraft coming anywhere near me, miles and miles and miles away, by using the sense of hearing. So a second I hear an airplane anywhere near, within miles and miles, I can immediately drop down to ground level and return safely. So there are other ways to get around that natural tendency to want to rely on sight, simply by allowing them to use another sense to detect full-scale aircraft. So it's very capable to do it safely if somebody would just look at those other options and say, yeah, there's other ways to detect and avoid full-scale aircraft.
How do you determine the direction of the sound?
Yeah, I've got experience, if I can, Jim.
Please do, because I couldn't hear the question.
Well, the question or the statement was that there are other ways of detecting traffic by potentially hearing that there's an aircraft out there and then descending down and flying back to a safe zone. And I've done some flying at an Army airfield in Germany when I was stationed there. And we could fly on the airfield because if we had any indication that there was an aircraft, we immediately, without question, landed our aircraft to remove ourselves as a risk. But we were flying within visual line of sight. So the hearing the aircraft that may be approaching or flying in the vicinity was a backup to our visual. So if somebody came up from behind us or something, we did not rely on that as a single source for detecting and then accurately and appropriately taking action to remove ourselves as a risk. I did want to also add something to what Jim said, since he's got us working on a lot of sense and avoid work these days, is that the nut to crack to solve the problem of sense and avoid and make sure that you meet a level of performance that would be acceptable is pretty substantial. So being able to do that needs to be validated in some way, and that's expensive. So the technology, and I think Jim's point is eventually that will happen, but right now the technology transition to the hobbyist, to the civil market, the cost associated with it, and the process to go through and validate that you can actually achieve an acceptable level is pretty substantial. And so it's coming, but it's not close.
One follow-up also.
across our country, of course, there's urban built-up areas, and then there's vast areas that there's simply nothing going on. You could stand in an area and there would be no air traffic for hours, if not days. Certain desert environments, canyons. Does the blanket really need to be there, for instance, to cover certain places where there simply would not be full-scale aircraft, lower altitude?
I'll assume you couldn't hear that one either.
Right. Without a microphone, I can't hear what people are saying.
Yeah. So the question was that the question was that there are various there's remote areas, there's built-up areas, there's low-altitude operations, and are those to be treated all in the same manner?
Well, there's no rules that would allow us to differentiate between them. I mean, obviously, when you're flying a model aircraft, it's much easier to maintain safe separation from manned aircraft if there are none around. So a remote area is by definition a safer, easier to operate area, less risky for you and for people on the ground and for aircraft. So it's common sense says that's the right way to go. But the rules don't slice it that fine, and we don't really have guidance material that would give you any better idea of how to do that. But I think that if you look at the guidelines from AMA, would probably be a better guide than the FAA's rules.
Okay, let's go on to a little bit different topic. Will the FAA help clubs enforce the rules?
Well, we would definitely help enforce our rules. I'm not sure we would have jurisdiction to enforce yours. But on the other hand, I think that if James were, for example, were at a facility and he saw somebody not following the rules, he'd probably tell them about it. And I think our inspectors in the field are always looking to make sure that operations are conducted safely. And if a model aircraft operator felt that there was things going on that weren't safe, all they've got to do is call their local flight standards district office, and I would imagine that they would be very happy to assist in making sure that things were safe. And if they didn't help you, call me. I'll help you.
Okay, along that same line, can we expect to have FAA direct their local authorities to openly coordinate with our clubs or members as they attempt to develop flying site operations within 5 miles of the airports? In other words, coordination requires two sides trying to accomplish the mission.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, most of the facilities that I've ever worked with are always very open to, especially on the air traffic side of the business, are always very open to trying to accommodate users of the airspace in whatever way they can. And again, if there's a particular facility that's that's not being cooperative, there's always the headquarters organizations to appeal to see if there isn't something we could do to help educate or persuade them to be a little more cooperative.
Okay, this becomes a little bit more definitive. The gentleman here is employed by a company that manufactures electronics for models. When he flies, he's getting paid. Does this become a commercial operation?
I've had these kind of discussions with our lawyers in numerous cases because I personally would like to find ways that we could promote this industry to grow in advance of the small unmanned aircraft rule. So I've had these these nuanced discussions with our lawyers, and essentially what they're saying is that if you're getting paid to operate the aircraft, in other words, that aircraft operation is what you're getting paid for, then it's a commercial operation. On the other hand, if you're operating your model aircraft during your lunch period and you're getting paid while you're operating the model aircraft, but you're not operating the model aircraft for your employer, then you're not getting paid to do it. So there's a lot of nuances there, and frankly, the bottom line is unless you cross that line into hazardous or reckless behavior, or careless or reckless, or you come to the attention of the FAA because you're operating a business illegally, then the key is operating safely. And if you're operating safely and there's no obvious commerce going on, we're not going to get involved.
Jim, if I remember correctly, in Section 336, there's language that includes the manufacturing process for model aircraft as well.
Absolutely. That's right. I forgot that. That's a good point.
Okay, last question. Will the he says FCC, but I'll change it to FAA, ever begin dialogue with hobbyists who are not AMA members?
Well, we conduct dialogue with any and everybody. I think the key to the way the law is written, and subsequently, obviously, the way the rule will be written, is that you're not considered to be operating as a modeler if you're not operating under the safety guidelines of some community-based organization. So, it isn't that you have to be a member of AMA to be operating safely, but it does mean that you need to have some basis for your operation to be considered safe. So, we'll dialogue with anybody. I work for the public of the United States, so I'll talk to anybody. Ask James. I'm on the road a lot. But so the bottom line is, we're not going to not talk to you because you're not an AMA member or operating according to AMA guidelines, and there's no prohibition for there being more than one model aircraft association that would be recognized under this law.
But by sheer nature, what you're saying then is anybody who's not part of the AMA, who is a hobbyist, isn't actually a hobbyist. That's
not correct.
Well, he just said you have to be part of a community-based organization.
No, that you have to use the standards that have been established by a community-based organization. So,
I see.
So if for instance, one of the tasks that Jim has me working on is establishing and refining a set of criteria to go along with what the Congress has directed us to do, which is not mess with model aviation, but to acknowledge community-based organizations that establish standards for operations, safety standards for operations. So we have to make sure that, not to speak for Jim, but we have to make sure that we establish criteria so that an organization that comes forth is really a representative organization that knows how to do model operations, conduct them safely, and does really represent a broader set of the modeling community.
All right, folks, in closing, I would like to thank Jim Williams for his activity. I'm sure that he has enlightened us with his comments and replies. I'd like to thank James Sizemore for his activity, and we'll see you later this evening.
I have one question, though.
Oh, no.
Did Georgia win?
Georgia Tech, no, they lost in overtime. I was watching a basketball game before this.
Okay. All right. Anyways, folks, I thank everyone for participating. Hopefully, as AMA members or attendees here at the convention, I think we've all learned something. I think that you can see the Academy has been working in a positive way with the FAA. And if you've been in attendance with this type of seminar over the last few years, I think you can say we are making positive progress. I thank Rich, his efforts. I thank the council. One gentleman that hasn't really been recognized, but he's a key to it, Mitch Rose. Would you please stand up? If you want to know who helps us in Washington a great deal, Mitch is the gentleman. He does a great job for us. He not only works with us with the FAA, he works with us in Congress. He's a great guy. I thank you, Mitch. This concludes this particular activity for today. Again, gentlemen, thank you very much for your efforts.
Thank you,
Thank
Jim.
you.
Appreciate it.
Have fun, James. I'm jealous.